for your patience with the sound. This is my first time to speak in an Academy event, so I'm a little nervous, and I had pictured giving a lecture to a classroom with students, so there are just too many of you. I want to thank Jen Benka and also the chancellors of the Academy of American Poets, which is the largest and most important organization in our country, helping keep poetry alive and in our culture. It's very important. I'd like to thank Dorothy Galbenki and Blaney for her generous endowment of this lecture series as well. My title of my lecture is not Persuasion, but Transport, the Poetry of Witness. That is a phrase from Longinus. During the past 2 years, I have traveled farther and more often than ever before in a life of wandering. My recent journeys took me to a country that very deeply marked my own generation, and then to a country digging through the rubble of an uprising. I traveled to read poetry in an island country celebrating 60 years of independence, and then in a country on the verge of economic collapse, a country that broke the shackles of apartheid, and another where poets had to meet secretly out of fear of reprisals. Poetry took me to all of these places, and today I would like to share with you some of what happened, and what I think I learned, and why, despite everything, I deeply believe that poetry is a force in the world. In April 2012, I traveled to Libya. So did Marilyn Hacker, one of the chancellors of the Academy. A country emerging from an uprising that overthrew the brutal 42-year dictatorship of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. The ruins left by NATO airstrikes on Tripoli had not been cleared. Vast swaths of the city lay in rubble. At that time, there was no police force, no garbage pickup, no postal service. There still isn't. The government was provisional, put in place to prepare for elections. But the first public event planned in Tripoli in the war's aftermath by the Provisional Ministry of Culture was an international poetry reading to be held in the open air under the stars near the ancient Roman ruin of the Marcus Aurelius Arch. I was among 22 poets invited. Most were from Arabic-speaking countries. Most were in Libya for the first time. And among our Libyan hosts were poets and writers who had at one time or another been imprisoned by Gaddafi. The first thing I noticed was that posters for our reading had been slapped on the bullet-riddled walls all over town. The posters covered up the bullet holes. There were spent shell casings strewn all over the ground, in the streets, in the market, everywhere I looked. And in the days that followed, one of the poets even picked up from the troubled earth a box of live, unspent ammunition. The Libyans welcomed us warmly in the hotel, in the streets, in the cafes, and especially on the night of the reading, when hundreds came to the Arch to sit on folding chairs where booklets of the poems to be read that night had been placed, translated into Arabic. There weren't enough chairs for the crowd that gathered. Children lined up along a wall overlooking the Arch. Men and women, veiled and unveiled, young and old, crowded around the Arch and into the adjacent streets. Large speakers had been mounted near the podium, the kind of speakers we see at rock concerts. Libyan television crews and also Al Jazeera arrived and set up their cameras. A dozen of their microphones were placed on the podium. Armed militia were everywhere in their various uniforms, and we were assured that they were there to provide our security. They smiled at us and gave us thumbs up and peace signs. On the walls there was graffiti having to do with the victory over the dictatorship. One read, in English, "Hold your heads up, you are free Libyans." Several English-speaking Libyans approached and expressed their gratitude to the United States and to NATO for helping them to defeat Gaddafi. I had given only a few open-air readings in my life, and never under a lighted Roman arch, to an audience who would not understand my language. "You'll be fine," the Palestinian poet Zakaria Mohammed assured me. "It will be good." I was asked to begin by reading with the poem The Colonel, written 34 years ago, a poem that arose out of an experience I had while working as a human rights activist in El Salvador. I protested that it was a very old poem, but they insisted and assured me that the poem translated into Arabic rather well. All right then, I thought, but the poem includes an obscenity, a 4-letter word, and I didn't know whether it was all right to use this word in public here. "We have our own version of this word." I said, "Don't worry." When I finished the poem, there was a murmur through the crowd, and I heard a little automatic weapons fire in the air. The crowd seemed to react to the poem in a way I had not expected, with enthusiasm and interest. But it was only later that I was told that they heard this poem about a Salvadoran colonel as a poem about their former dictator, Colonel Gaddafi. They translated the sense of the poem not only into Arabic from English, but into their time and place. I read several more poems and took my seat. During the rest of the readings, I heard more automatic gunfire. And I must have been looking around a bit anxiously, because the Libyan man seated next to me finally leaned over and said, "They're firing into the air because they like the poem." Another first for me. I had never heard AK rifle fire as a form of applause. After the readings, the audience members crowded around us, shaking our hands, hugging us, some of them with tears in their eyes. One woman, about my age, took both hands in mine and said, "This means we're a normal country, that we can have a poetry reading in our city. We're finally a normal country." Another first. I had never heard it claimed that poetry readings conferred normalcy in human communities, that hosting a poetry reading contributed to the possibility of a future for the city of Tripoli. Months later, our ambassador to Libya was murdered in Benghazi, along with his bodyguards, an act that horrified the people of Libya, as it horrified Americans, an act all too frequently committed in the ruins of war's aftermath and in the political labors of a country giving birth to itself, for the first time, as a parliamentary democracy. In a strange way, I feel that at least in Tripoli, they might succeed, and I feel this because of that night, when the city gathered to hear poetry in the open air. A month earlier, I had traveled to Hanoi and Hue, Vietnam, with a group of American veterans of that war, to be welcomed by a group of Vietnamese veterans who had fought on the other side. These soldiers, 20 years ago, together, built the first bridge between their countries in the war's aftermath, quietly making contact with each other through the poetry and stories they were writing about their war experience. The US government had imposed an embargo on trade with Vietnam, and all contact between our countries was cut off. At the same time, the new government of a united Vietnam was deeply suspicious of the United States. Kevin Bowen, a poet and director of the Joyner Center for the Study of War and its Social Consequences at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, led the effort. First, to provide artificial arms and legs to those Vietnamese maimed during the war, defying the embargo. And then to translate the poetry and stories written by Vietnamese veterans. He then invited a few of his former combat enemies to come to the United States and give readings as the two governments quietly looked the other way. Kevin Bowen, Bruce Weigel, Yusef Komonyaka, and others, combat veterans all, then made what they called full circle journeys back to Vietnam to walk the hills, fields, and rice paddies of their violent youth. It was then discovered that the United States possessed in an archive in Washington, D.C., boxes of captured documents, papers and small notebooks confiscated from the corpses of dead Vietnamese soldiers during the war. It had been thought at the time that such papers might contain information of military importance, logistical information, battle plans. The documents, however, were in Vietnamese, so no one among the Americans in the field could ascertain what was important and what wasn't. All were sent to Washington for analysis and eventually warehoused. Kevin Bowen and the other veteran poets pressured to have the boxes opened, and when the captured documents were translated, it was discovered that most of it was poetry written by Vietnamese soldiers. Love poems to their sweethearts, poems of longing and despair, poems about nature, life, and death. The American veteran poets persuaded the United States government to send these documents back to Vietnam as a gesture of goodwill. They were received with gratitude and conferred an unexpected benefit. The documents helped the Vietnamese to solve their own missing in action problem. Soldiers missing in action and never accounted for. Soldiers who could not technically be confirmed dead on the field of battle. Where possible, the documents were returned to the soldiers' families, who now knew the truth about their own loved ones. They had something in their grasp that had once belonged to their sons, husbands, fathers, and brothers. Many more exchanges were arranged between the writers and poets in the years that followed. I had been working with veterans at the Joiner Center during the summers, and I remember one night especially when the Vietnamese writers cooked their specialties in Kevin's kitchen while the American veterans grilled chicken and steaks. And then they all played basketball on the half-court in Kevin's backyard, later prompting the American poet to title his poetry collection, Playing Basketball with the Viet Cong. The bridge between the two countries was sturdier now and had been crossed many times. Later, official relations and trade began to be normalized. But it was the poets who were first, who crossed when the bridge was still invisible and made of words. This year was the 20th anniversary of those first tentative steps. The Vietnamese Writers Association invited us back because they wanted to honor Kevin and his fellow poets and writers formally, to reach across the horrors of that war, the years of that war, and celebrate the peace that had been achieved and the strength of the Poets' Bridge. I had never been to Vietnam. It was for me a place where my first husband and my childhood friends fought. Young men from Michigan who were wounded or died in a war I opposed as a young woman, marching in the streets of East Lansing and Ann Arbor with other university students, carrying our signs, intellectually uncertain of the war's true dimensions, but feeling in our hearts that it was wrong, and realizing to our horror that our government wasn't telling us the truth, as has now been substantively disclosed. During our stay in Vietnam, we gave poetry readings and visited Buddhist temples and the cemeteries of the war dead, the cemeteries of the 10,000 graves, of which there are many, a sea of gravestones, all the same size, like our Arlington National Cemetery, but gray rather than white, with incense sticks burning beside pots of chrysanthemum. We walked in the now peaceful fields of the former American bases and battlefields, Khe Sanh, Quang Tri, and the former demilitarized zone. We traveled all the way to the Laotian border. The American poets relived their war experience and were comforted by their Vietnamese counterparts, who gave them endless cups of tea, pots of rice, fish, and delicacies, bowls of pho. Standing in one place or another, a seemingly innocuous place near a tree or a stone, one or another of the poets would suddenly grow quiet or burst into tears. It isn't over, and it will never be over. We don't live after such experiences as war, but rather in their aftermath, wherein the past is always present, is with us, but we go on toward our future, and it goes with us. That sense of past and present converging happens in a good many poems. In a sense, poems can be ghosted language, imprinted by extremity, carrying with it in resonant images a darker human suffering. I am often asked about the role of the writer and the poet in the United States, his or her relation to the public world. This especially occurred when I returned from El Salvador in 1980 and published what was then viewed as a controversial book of poems. What is the role of the poet in society, I was asked. What is our responsibility? During the past few decades, I think that the perception of that role has changed somewhat. This may have begun with the fatwa issued by the former Iranian spiritual leader Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini against Salman Rushdie on February 14, 1989, for his book Satanic Verses. This fatwa called the literary world to attention over the plight of an author condemned to death for his writing, and demanded a response from writers all over the world. In the early hours of that crisis in the United States, we were asked to sign letters and petitions, appear on national news broadcasts, and make public our support of Rushdie and our condemnation of the fatwa form of literary censorship, or what V.S. Naipaul called an extreme form of literary criticism. The rallying cry then was, "We are all Salman Rushdie." Later that same year, the pro-democracy movement was crushed at Tiananmen Square. And the poet Beidou, in Berlin at the time, was accused of inciting events, as his poetry had appeared on banners held aloft by the demonstrators. In former Czechoslovakia that December, the playwright Václav Havel, 3 times imprisoned critic of totalitarianism, became president of his country. And so the momentous year ended with sleigh bells and candlelight in Wenceslaw Square. Poets and writers in the United States beheld the spectacle of a novelist forced into hiding, a poet exiled in absentia, and a playwright borne on the shoulders of his countrymen as they chanted Havel nach Rad, Havel to the castle. Beidou began teaching, first in Sweden, then in Denmark, Germany, and the United States. Salman Rushdie was offered the protection of Scotland Yard. Václav Havel was invited to address a joint session of the United States Congress on February 21st, 1990. Havel appeared officially as a foreign head of state, but spoke in the authentic voice of the literary writer, a voice perhaps not heard before in those chambers, where speeches are the labor not of individual conscience, but of speech-writing committees. What he had to say partly concerned the question of the role of the writer and intellectual. Quote, "We are still destroying the planet that was entrusted to us and its environment. We still close our eyes to the growing social, ethnic, and cultural conflicts in the world. From time to time we say that the anonymous mega machinery we have created for ourselves no longer serves us, but rather enslaved us. Yet we still fail to do anything about it. We still don't know how to put morality ahead of politics, science, and economics. We are still incapable of understanding that the only genuine backbone of all our actions, if they are going to be moral, is responsibility to something higher than my family, my country, my firm, my success. Responsibility to the order of being, where all our actions are indelibly recorded and where, and only where, they will be properly judged. This is why I ultimately decided, after resisting for a long time, to accept the burden of political responsibility. I'm not the first, nor will I be the last intellectual to do this. On the contrary, my feeling is that there will be more and more of them all the time. If the hope of the world lies in human consciousness, then it is obvious that intellectuals cannot go on forever avoiding their share of responsibility for the world and hiding their distaste for politics under an alleged need to be independent, end quote. His audience was our legislature. Well, it was a little better then. But also the citizens of this republic and the world at a special moment when the burden of totalitarian oppression had been lifted not only from the former Czech lands, but throughout the former Soviet Empire. At that time, I was attempting to bring the work to fruition against forgetting, 20th century poetry of witness, an anthology of poets from all over the world who had endured extremity during the past century: war, imprisonment, torture, exile, house arrest, banning orders, and extreme forms of censorship. Experiences of suffering collectively inflicted due to the vicissitudes of history and the depredations of the state. It was comprised of the work of 145 poets, writing in 30 languages, and it was the culmination of efforts to introduce my students to world poetry, works in translation, and the practice of reading for the mark or trace of witness. As the former Soviet Empire was breaking apart, I found myself hastily calling newly installed consulates of independent republics so as to revise the sections having to do with the poets of the former Warsaw Pact. I would call them and say, "What do you want your country to be called now?" And they kept changing the names of these countries every couple of weeks. It was driving Norton crazy. That volume is 20 years old this year, and will be joined in January by a companion, edited together with my friend and colleague, Romanticist scholar Duncan Wu of Georgetown University. When we first began teaching together in 2008, he proposed that I consider reading back through English language poetry to gather works of witness from our own tradition. I hesitated, as the first effort had absorbed me for 13 years. But that volume, Poetry of Witness, the Tradition in English, 1500 to 2001, will be published by W.W. Norton this coming January. Included are 111 poets, and among those who experienced war, imprisonment, torture, exile, religious and political persecution, censorship, and execution, and whose works do, at least in part, constitute evidence of such experience, include St. Thomas More, Sir Walter Raleigh, William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, John Milton, Andrew Marvell, William Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley and Keats, Whitman, Dickinson, and Yeats, and a good number of others you would recognize. They were variously surveilled, accused of treason, sentenced to death by decapitation and slower, more gruesome deaths. They were kept in solitary confinement, forced to labor on slave ships, traded and owned as slaves, and accused of supporting abolition. They were Catholic when the religion was outlawed, Irish under English rule, Americans nursing Civil War soldiers on the battlefield, and they were soldiers in the trenches of the Great War and those that followed. They were English language poets all, from England and her former colonies. Scarcely a poet until the year 1900 escapes inclusion even under the strictest of criteria, the strictest being for the past century that they now be dead. Everybody in the anthology is dead. There would be so many poets of witness in our tradition, almost so as to constitute a plurality of voices, came as not much of a surprise, but taken together. What we held in our hands was a tome of such weight and such magnitude that it became impossible any longer to read English language poetry other than inextricably bound to an art marked by the world, by struggle and violence, by opposition to injustice, and a willingness to sacrifice personal freedom, well-being, and life itself in the interests of humankind. Citing but a few examples, we begin with St. Thomas More in 1535, who wrote poetry with pieces of coal while confined in the Tower of London, awaiting death by being hung, drawn, and quartered. The poem, Davy the Dicer, was written following a visit by Thomas Cromwell, sent by Henry VIII to soften up the saint's feelings toward the king before the saint was to be executed. Despite his imminent death and the ordeal of prison, he expresses gratitude for the hours in which he was free to write poems. Considered imprisonment a good opportunity for doing his work. He wrote, "In faith, I bless you again 1,000 times for lending me now some leisure to make rhymes." Those lines were among his last. Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, whom we have to thank for the felicitous invention of blank verse, unrhymed iambic pentameter, attempted to escape the Tower of London by crawling down a toilet leading into the Thames, but was caught and later beheaded. Sir Walter Raleigh of myth and legend spent the eve of his beheading writing his last poems. I share with you his last. "Even such a time, which takes in trust our youth, our joys, and all we have, and pays us but with age and dust, who in the dark and silent grave, when we have wandered all our ways, shuts up the story of our days, and from which earth and grave and dust, the Lord shall raise me up, I trust." Among the Catholic priests who were poets at the time Elizabeth I made it treasonous to practice anything but the state religion was St. Robert Southwell of the Society of Jesus, who was arrested while attempting to say Mass at a private residence. He was manacled at the wrists, with his feet standing upon the ground, and his hands but as high as he could reach against the wall, and subjected to a form of torture by which internal injury was inflicted without causing outward marks on the body. Southwell was almost dead when they cut him down. He spent the next 2.5 years in solitary confinement in a tiny cell in the Tower of London and then at Newgate. Found guilty of being a priest, he was punished by being drawn to Tyburn upon a hurdle, there to be hanged and cut down alive, his bowels to be burned before his face, his head to be stricken off, his body to be corded and disposed at Her Majesty's pleasure. He was canonized one of the English martyrs in 1970. Among his canonical poems is The Burning Bay, and here are a few lines from one of his last poems, I Die Alive. "I live, but such a life as never dies. I die, but such a death as never ends. My death to end my dying life, denies, and my life, my living death, no wit amends. Thus still I die, yet still I do revive. My living death by dying, life is fed. Grace more than nature keeps my heart alive, whose idle hopes and vain desires are dead. During the Civil War in Britain, there were conflicts in England, Scotland, and Ireland. From war-related disease alone, England would lose 4% of her population, Scotland 6%, and Ireland 41%. Many poets of the period served on one side or the other. Vaughan, Bunyan, Wither, Herrick, Lestrange, Graham, Fairfax, and their writings testify to what they witnessed. To be wounded by musket shot, even superficially, was a serious matter in an age when medical treatment consisted chiefly in amputation. Poets who risked their lives or saw their friends do so speak of the human cost in ways that foreshadow the poets of the Great War. John Milton went into hiding just days before his arrest for his anti-royalist sentiments. On January 27, 1660, all known copies of Milton's books were incinerated. He spent his 57th birthday in the Tower of London, where, were it not for the intervention of friends, including Marble, he might have been executed. But he was released and went on to complete Paradise Lost. The years following his imprisonment and release were anxious ones. He lived in political ignominy, fearful of arrest, and in the invocation of Paradise Lost, Book 7, describes himself as fallen on evil days, though fallen and evil tongues, in darkness and with dangers compassed round, and solitude. At the age of 23, John Newton was conscripted on board Her Majesty's ship Harwich to serve in the Royal Navy during the War of the Austrian Succession. Having attempted to escape, he was caught, put in irons, and flogged in front of other sailors with cat-o'-nine-tails. He was then transferred to a slave trading vessel, transporting its cargo for years. He became responsible, among other things, for putting sailors in irons, raping female slaves, flogging rebellious slaves, and torturing small children, including on one occasion applying thumb screws to 4 boys who were afterward imprisoned in neck yokes. On March 10, 1748, he awakened in the middle of the night to find his ship breaking apart in a storm. Newton prayed for deliverance. By the following morning, the ship was heavily damaged, but most of the crew had survived. Though he continued as a slave trader until 1755, Newton began to read the Bible, committed himself to a form of evangelical Calvinism, and repented of his past, turning eventually to the abolitionist cause. In later years, he wrote the hymn, Amazing Grace. The cover of our anthology features a painting by William Blake, an image illustrative of the line, around St. James's glow the fires ever to the city gate. An image not from Blake's imagination, but from eyewitness experience. He may have needed little encouragement to join the Gordon rioters when they swept toward him on the evening of June 6, 1780. For at 22 years old, he was of their generation and shared their disdain for the social and economic inequalities of Georgian London. He followed them to Newgate Prison, where some of them had been detained, and watched as they demolished it, liberating some 300 prisoners, including 5 under sentence of death. Then they torched it, many clambering onto precarious parts of the building, urinating into the flames and screaming obscenities from the rooftops. Blake was a peaceable man who, unlike Wordsworth, would not defend revolutionary violence, but he cannot have been immune to what he saw. and most certainly witnessed events the following night when the district round Holborn was like a volcano. The King's Bench and Fleet prisons burned down, toll houses on Blackfriars Bridge set on fire, full-scale battle waged on the steps of the Bank of England, and scores of other fires ignited across London. Small wonder that when Blake composed a Song of Liberty for the marriage of heaven and hell, he conceived of revolution in apocalyptic terms, as the newborn fire with fiery limbs, bringing an end to the financial system, the British Empire, organized religion which Blake regarded with contempt as corrupt. A few months later, Blake was one of the several artists touring Medway when taken prisoner by a group of soldiers who believed them to be French spies. They were released when their membership in the Royal Academy was confirmed, but it was an indication to Blake of how easily power might be abused. Here is his poem, London. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mine-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and hapless soldiers' sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's ear and blights with plague the marriage hearse. William Wordsworth, most often read as a harmless nature poet, was for a time considered a serious security threat by the government. The Home Office, this should be kind of familiar to you, was sufficiently concerned to send an agent to spy on him and his sister Dorothy in 1797 when they were resident in Somersetshire, where it was believed the French would begin their invasion of Britain. At first, James Walsh, the agent, believed them to be French emigres. His revised opinion was that they and Coleridge comprised a nest of disaffected Englishmen. And he finally concluded that the rascals from Elphoxton, where Wordsworth lived, were a set of violent Democrats, potential leaders of a rebellion. This was less absurd than it sounds. 5 years before, by his own admission, Wordsworth was pretty hot in it, it being the French Revolution. He was 20 when he crossed the Channel, possibly as the guest of Jacques-Pierre Rousseau, leader of the Girondist faction, guillotined October 1793. Here is an excerpt from The Prelude, Book 10. You'll know this one. Bliss it was in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. O times in which the meager, stale, forbidding ways of custom, law, and statute took at once the attraction of a country in romance, when reason seemed the most to assert her rights, when most intent on making of herself a prime enchanter to assist the work which was then going forward in her name, not favored spots alone, but the whole earth. When Francis Scott Key was detained by his hosts on a truce ship, Key was compelled to watch the British rocket attack on the star-shaped Fort McHenry during the Battle of Baltimore. It lasted 24 hours, in the course of which 20 British ships were sunk by American cannon. At the end of the bombardment, the American flag at the fort emerged unscathed, and Key began composing his poem, Defense of Fort McHenry, the original title of our Star-Spangled Banner. I know that poetry begins in a not knowing rather than a moral impulse. A poet's consciousness is in this sense, improvisational and open to transformation, felicitous accidents, and an intuitive response to language generating meaning and music. That is true, whether the spark igniting the poem comes from a word, a phrase, an image, or a moment of experience, present or remembered. This spark was what Osip Mandelstam called porýv, or impulse, and what Emerson thinks of as what is oldest and best in us, an alien visitor. This not knowing is a hovering and receptive state of consciousness, without intention or conscious knowledge of direction. I also know that consciousness can be incised by experience, seared by memory, awakened by what is seen and lived, and that the poet's language also passes through the fire and is marked by it. The surrender of conscious control, so necessary to the receptive artistic state, does not mean that the mark of experience will not be burned into the poem and be made legible there. When we read for this mark, we read for witness, and at times, along with aesthetic pleasure and the frisson of newly made meanings, we are also not perhaps persuaded, but certainly transported to regions of experience that might inform our conscience, so as to make art in the light of it, as poet Marina Tsvetaeva once proposed. Havel concluded his speech by praising the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the Constitution of the United States as documents of enduring inspiration to the world. In closing, Havel had this to say: history has accelerated. I believe that once again it will be the human spirit that will notice this acceleration, give it a name, and transform those words into deeds. This brings me to the present, wherein we are experiencing a dizzying historical acceleration. We know that technological developments are double-edged in the sense that they enable and disable certain human capacities. The speed in communicative technology, the speed at which we are bombarded by information and imagery, and at which we are expected to process it, has eroded our ability to sustain the contemplation so necessary to the creative act. We have developed a certain skittishness, flitting through the web, link to link, through the labyrinths of social media at twittering speed. We're grateful that we can look up any fact, translate any word into 50 languages at once. We have entered Indra's luminous web of interconnection, and we also live in the midst of a tsunami of information, data, and statistics. But does this grant us knowledge and wisdom, which require patient assimilation and judgment? I think of literary writing as a means of retrieving a human knowledge irretrievable by other means. Composing poems and writing stories is a meditative, spiritual act of resistance. It requires a capacity to sustain contemplation, to be attentive to all that is about us, and to hold within ourselves an awareness that we are here in our living moment between two unknown realms, before our births and after our deaths. We speak through art to the millennia of artists who came before us, and the art we make will send its messages to the human future. Curiosity about our predecessors and care for our descendants is a collective accomplishment. Art is what is left behind, and art is what we will leave to the world to come. We gaze at the same moon as the cave painters of Chauvet, even though there are now boot prints upon it. The wine-dark seas of Homer are still our seas, even if part of their waters are now dead zones. If we retain our capacity for meditative awareness, the language of art, which allows us to speak through time, will not be lost. The slow, solitary engagement with music and word, paint and light, with our bodies in space and time, that is the precondition of making art, might not only preserve our capacities as artists, but as humans possessed of intuitive intelligence and inner life. The poets and artists are conversant with the centuries, and their visions may address the most pressing need of the epoch, that of saving the biosphere of Earth. Poetry needs no other justification.